Hi, everyone. My name is Andy Rotman. I'm a professor at Smith College in the Religion Department, the Department of Buddhist Studies and South Asian Studies, and I'm a specialist in South Asian religions. And I'm really excited today to talk to you about hungry ghosts. I recently completed a book about hungry ghosts, and in the next half an hour, you're going to learn a lot about hungry ghosts, more than you ever knew before, I hope. And maybe it will change your views about other humans and how you might interact with them and what faults they might possess. So let's start. What am I going to do? In this talk, I'm going to talk about hungry ghosts. And what I want to do is first offer you a general orientation of what they are within particularly the Buddhist tradition and a connection as well to the Hindu tradition. Then I want to focus in on one particular corpus of stories, and within that one story in particular, as a way to begin to think about how these beings, known as hungry ghosts, kind of came to be and what makes them tick. Then I want to step back out and think about their particular faults. What is it that gets one to be reborn as a hungry ghost? And then finally, I want to look at the world of images and think about how these hungry ghosts have been depicted and what we might be able to learn from looking at these images. So we'll go step by step. I'll keep you abreast of where we are in this chronology, and I'll try to make it interesting and fun. And I'll tell you, at least from my perspective, thinking about hungry ghosts and engaging with them has been transformative. It's changed the way I see the fault of meanness. It's changed the way I think about cruelty in the world. And it's also given me a path out, a way to think of how can I be a little less cruel, a little less mean, and how might I be able to encourage others to do the same? So let's start. What's a hungry ghost? Within the Buddhist realm, they often talk about 5 or 6 realms of existence. You can be reborn as a human, as we are, or we could say lower rebirths would be the realms of animals, the realms of hungry ghosts, which we'll get to, and the realms of hell beings. And above us, the divine worlds, particularly the realm of gods, and sometimes the realm of asuras, these kind of anti-gods or higher deities that fight with the gods. And for many of us who've engaged in the kind of world of Buddhism, we've probably seen it in the Bhava Chakra, this kind of the wheel of existence, which I'll be showing you images of later. And there's this one corner of beings, hungry ghosts. So the question is, what are these hungry ghosts? We can imagine being reborn in a divine realm. Within the Buddhist logic, there are a whole host of good deeds that you could do and be reborn as one of the gods. And there isn't just one kind of God, there are many kinds of gods. And we have different divine realms, so we can have different kinds of attainments and be reborn as a reward for our good deeds in one of these divine realms. Likewise, there's all different kinds of animals that we could be reborn as. With this same Buddhist logic of karma, you reap what you sow, you do a good deed, you have a good rebirth, bad deed, bad rebirth. And there are many kinds of animal realms, and particularly, there are many kinds of hell realms in the Buddhist world. They talk about 10 hot realms and 10 cold realms. So you get this sense of there's a whole host of good deeds you could do with good results, a whole host of bad deeds you could do with bad results. But what's interesting about the realm of hungry ghosts is they basically focus on one deed that is done that leads to a rebirth in hungry ghosts. They focus on one particular phenomenon and they hold it out, and that's what leads to this particular and odd rebirth. Now, before I get to this idea of what this one thing is, what's interesting, I think, about this isn't some kind of, we could say, metaphysical notions about rebirth. What we're going to find that's really important about this is that Buddhists have something smart to say about moral psychology. They have something kind of smart to say about what makes humans tick, and also how humans develop certain kind of psychological attributes, what from the Buddhist perspective is a psychological flaw or a fault, a dosha, and how we might be able to avoid these faults, but also the dangerous ways that these faults develop into something that's kind of catastrophic, not only for the person, but for the community in which that person lives. So what is this fault that leads one to be reborn as a hungry ghost? In the Buddhist realm, in the earliest text that we have, it's called Matsarya, in Pali, Macharya. And this I translate as meanness. Now, I'm saying it's meanness, but it's a very particular kind of meanness that they're focusing on. And this is part of a large part of what I'm going to be talking about today, is to think about what is Buddhist meanness? How does it work? How do we avoid it? How do we eradicate it? So the Buddhist world has this idea of a kind of double meanness. It's a meanness that the Buddhists say that starts with a kind of a clinging, a miserliness, a holding on to possessions. And that leads to this other form of meanness, which is a cruel and spiteful acting out. So it starts with a kind of clinging, and it leads to a kind of lashing out. And what the Buddhists will say, what's particularly dangerous about this lashing out is that that also leads to a kind of self-righteousness. It's a kind of false notion of what is just and righteous. You think you know what truth is. You think you know what righteousness is, but you're wrong. And that particular vision of righteousness imagines the world as a kind of battleground so that anybody else's gain is your loss. So it creates some beings who are clinging to their possessions, who are fearful that anyone else will get anything that somehow doesn't belong to them, or that will somehow make them higher in the pecking order than themselves. And in their deluded fashion, they will act out spitefully against these beings. So what I want to do is try to make sense of this pathology. And I want to start doing it by looking at some of the earliest stories that we have about hungry ghosts. So what's interesting about hungry ghosts, yet again, is that most of what we know in the earliest fashion comes from texts. It doesn't come from images. Within the early kind of Indian, kind of, we could say, world, there are almost no images of hell beings or hungry ghosts in the pre-modern era. It's almost like there was a provision not to represent them. So what we know about these beings is really from what we find in texts. And one way to start with these texts, and what I want to do here, is looking at material from the Avadana Shataka. This is a compilation of 100 stories, probably written sometime the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century CE, but probably versions of it even earlier. And these stories that started separately were then incorporated into the law books of the Buddhists, particularly the Mulasarvastivadins, and have become, we could say, these are stories that have come to function as law for the monastic community and for the lay community. These are just stories that people would tell. Most likely, these are stories that monks would have told lay people when they were on their begging rounds, or simply when they met some lay people and lay people said, "Hey, can you give me a teaching?" And the monks would have had these stories memorized. And one of the great attributes that early monastics had were they were great storytellers. This is one way of being a good teacher. As a professor myself, I know it's very useful to have good stories to exemplify points. And this is one of those collections. So it's a collection of 100 stories. And the text is divided up into sections of 10. There are 10 stories about predictions of becoming a Buddha, 10 stories about the Buddha's previous life, 10 stories about beings known as solitary Buddhas who wander in the woods, and 10 stories about hungry ghosts. So in the volume I just completed, I translate these 10 stories, among other kind of aspects of trying to make sense of the world of hungry ghosts, as a way of just kind of figuring out what's happening from the earliest stage and how ideas about hungry ghosts change over time. And also how ideas about meanness, we might say, change over time. So what I want to do is start with one of these stories. It's a short one, as a way to enter into this Buddhist world of meanness and the Buddhist world of hungry ghosts. And I want to start with a short story, and it's called A Pot of Shit, Varchagataha. And I'm going to read it to you and offer some comments. And this is actually a very traditional way within the Indian world of teaching and exemplification, where someone tells a story and then offers comments on it. So here it goes. The Lord Buddha was respected, honored, revered, and venerated by kings, royal ministers, the wealthy, city dwellers, merchants, caravan leaders, gods, nagas, yakshas, anti-gods, heavenly birds, kinnaras, and great snakes. So this opening sentence is actually part of a stereotypical passage. We find it at the beginning of many of the stories here. And what it's doing is it's beginning to set a stage. It's talking about who the Buddha is, because many people would simply not know who the Buddha is when they're first hearing these stories. And what do we know about him? We know that he's respected, honored, revered, and venerated by a whole host of different kinds of humans, and we might say heavenly beings. So we're like, oh, this is a person that other people respect. And then it continues, worshipped as such by gods, nagas, yakshas, anti-gods, heavenly birds, kinnaras, and great snakes. The Lord Buddha, who was renowned and possessed great merit, received provisions of robes, begging bowls, bedding and seats, and medicines to cure the sick. So now we have the second idea, which will actually become important when we think about kind of meanness, the kind of the fault that afflicts hungry ghosts, is here, these other beings who kind of recognize the Buddha for what he is, a being who has great merit, offer him provisions and of basic goods, robes, begging bowls, bedding, medicine, for the Buddha and the monastic community. And what it's offering here is a kind of template that what we should do when we see people who are worthy of honor or respect is treat them with kindness and maybe make offerings to them, offering them provisions that are useful for them and their community. Then it continues, once he was staying near the city of Rajagriha with the community made up of his disciples at the bamboo grove in Kalandaka Nivapa, squirrel feeding place. So this is the way these opening segments often end, is it places the Buddha or compatriots in a real place. And here they're actually placing him in Rajagriha, which was the capital of ancient Magadha, right in the middle of India, and in a bamboo grove. So at this time, the Buddhist community, often there weren't permanent monastic settlements, and instead they would stay in parks and groves just outside the city. We could think of it as almost a kind of camping. And from there, then the Buddha and the monastic community, they could wander into the city that they were next to for alms. At this time, they're living fully on alms. This is a moment before any private possessions for the monastic community. So, and now the story starts in proper. One morning, the Venerable Moggallana, this is one of the Buddha's chief disciples, got dressed, took his bowl and robe, and entered Rajagriha for alms. After wandering through Rajagriha for alms, he ate his meal, and after eating, he returned from his alms round. Then he put away his bowl and robe, washed his feet, and approached Vulture's Peak. Having approached, he made his way up Vulture's Peak and then sat down at the base of a tree for a midday rest. So here, this is as we're saying that the Buddha and the community lived just outside a city so that they could wander into the city for alms, and various monastics will wander in for alms, eat their meal, and then at this case, the Venerable Moggallana goes to Vulture's Peak. Now, Vulture's Peak is a place that's famous within the Buddhist world because the Buddha made some very famous sermons there, including the fire sermon, well known, one of his earliest sermons. So it's a place that's loaded with kind of religious and cultural significance. And we could almost think of it as a kind of holy place. So he goes to this place, and then what happens? Then the Venerable Moggallana saw a hungry ghost who looked like a burned out tree stump, naked and totally covered with hair, with a mouth like the eye of a needle and a stomach like a mountain. She was ablaze, alight, aflame, a single fiery mass, a perpetual cremation. Tormented by thirst, she was racked with sensations that were searing, piercing, distressing, agonizing, and acute, and she was crying out in pain. She was foul smelling, really foul smelling, and she was feeding on feces, and even those she only procured with difficulty. So here's our first introduction to a hungry ghost. And we don't know anything about their psychological states, but we know a lot about their physical states, right? I mean, what is it like to be a hungry ghost? One is they look like a burned out tree stump, right? We can imagine them at this camp kind of burned and shriveled, naked, and also totally covered with hair. And then a mouth like the eye of a needle and a stomach like a mountain. And this we'll find within the kind of the Buddhist world here for hungry ghosts is a kind of curse. They've been offered a body that simply can never nourish itself. Imagine having a mouth that was so tiny it was like the eye of a needle, and a stomach that was simply mountainous in size. you could never fill yourself. So this is what we're going to find is one of the karmic repercussions of having done mean activities, matsarya-filled activities as a human, is that one is reborn as a hungry ghost and one can never satisfy oneself. More than that too, she's a blaze, a light, a flame, a single fiery mass, a perpetual cremation. Actually here the text is, the idea here is that because of their bad karma, they're kind of burning in flames. And they're actually like an auto-cremation. Because of their own bad karma, they're setting themselves on fire. So this is a body that's a kind of prison house, a body that's a kind of torture chamber, a body that no one would want to have, which is another way of saying, don't cultivate meanness now because the results will be something that you do not want. So, and this being is tormented by thirst and racked with all these painful sensations. And literally, this is not figurative in this. There's this way that hungry ghosts are immersed in a world of urine and excrement. And what they're trying to do is that hungry ghosts are actually kind of disgusting. And in a way, you have a disgusting result for a disgusting activity. So in many ways, for the Buddhist world, this is making a commentary on meanness. Meanness is as disgusting as this result. So what happens next? Upon seeing her, the Venerable Moggallana was deeply moved, and he questioned the hungry ghost. What sin did you commit such that you experience a result like this? I am a sinner, Bhadanta Moggallana, the hungry ghost said. Ask the Blessed One about the matter. He will explain to you the deed that led to this fate. And when other beings hear this account, they will refrain from this sinful deed. So here's the logic of this story, is that Moggallana meets a hungry ghost. The hungry ghost has done something terrible. The hungry ghost is a sinner. So the hungry ghost encourages Moggallana to reach out to the Buddha to find out what happened so that when others will hear this, they won't do the deed that led this being to this horrific fate. So the Venerable Moggallana approached the Blessed One, the Buddha. At that time, the Blessed One had just emerged from meditative seclusion and was giving the fourfold assembly an explanation of the sweet Dharma, sweet like pure honey. The assembly of many hundreds of beings listened to the sweet Dharma of the Blessed One with faculties unwavering. So the idea is that Moggallana comes to the Buddha, and the Buddha is actually giving a discourse, a story perhaps like this, but trying to explain the Dharma, the right way to be in the world, the law, or we might think of it as a righteous way to be in the world that will lead to righteous and good results, unlike the bad results that this hungry ghost is currently experiencing. So now, Lord Buddhas speak first out of propriety, speak kindly, offer words of welcome, come near, and smile first and foremost. Basically, Lord Buddhas are really nice. And so the Blessed One said this to the Venerable Moggallana. Come near, Moggallana, welcome, where are you coming from? Bhadanta Moggallana said, I'm coming from a journey through the realm of hungry ghosts. There I saw a hungry ghost who looked like a burned out tree stump, naked and totally covered with hair, with a mouth like the eye of a needle and a stomach like a mountain. She was a blaze, a light, a flame, a single fiery mass, racked with sensations that were searing, piercing, distressing, agonizing, and acute. She was crying out in pain. Just by her sight, rivers and wells would dry up, and when the heavens sent rain on her, would fall a shower of sparks and embers. She was foul smelling, really foul smelling, and she was feeding on feces. And even those she only procured with difficulty. So one of the interesting things, I think, when we hear these descriptions of hungry ghosts is it almost seems like an oxymoron, right? I mean, the idea here is it's a body whose horrors we can only begin to imagine. They're like a burnt out stump, and they're naked, and they're covered with hair, and they're a fiery mass, and they have a tiny throat, and they have a giant stomach. The idea here in some ways is that it's trying to conjure something that will simply stretch your imagination and horribleness. And it's something that the idea here is that this image in some ways is so arresting and horrifying that maybe humans like us and you hearing these stories will be scared straight. The idea that you'll hear this and think, right, I really don't want that outcome. And instead, I want to do something different. So then Moggallana recites this verse. And he says, naked in her suit, emaciated like an upright skeleton, racked with searing sensations and crying out in pain, What terrible sin did she commit in the world of mortals, such that she now experiences such horrific suffering? So now we have one more element in the horrific suffering that many hungry ghosts experience. And what's that? Because of their terrible karma, not only are they born with a body, with a tiny mouth and a giant stomach, such that they can never nourish themselves, but whatever food and drink they pick up turns into urine and excrement, right? It's like such a horrible curse, right? The idea that you could never nourish yourself. And whenever you did find food or drink, it would turn into something impure and horrifying and not nourishing, soiling, literally. So then the Blessed One said, Moggulliana, that Blessed One is a sinner. Do you want to hear the deed that led her to this fate? Yes, Bhadanta. Then listen to this, Moggulliana. Concentrate well and closely. I will speak. Now, the Buddha often says this in stories, concentrate well and closely. And the idea is that these are teachings. They're seemingly simple stories, but they're teachings to live by. These are teachings that function as law, or teachings almost that functions as objects of contemplation, something for us to ponder and think over so that we can be better humans. So now the Buddha tells this story. Long ago, Moggulliana, in the city of Varanasi, there was a solitary Buddha who had compassion for the poor and neglected, and who stayed in remote areas. Now, the Buddha is telling about a previous time when there was a Buddha, not like him, who offers teachings, as he's doing right now, but a solitary Buddha, in Sanskrit, a Pratyeka Buddha. And these Buddhas live, we could say, apart from other humans, and they don't offer teaching verbally. They offer teachings actually by action. We'll find them simply doing things in the world and people learning, but they don't create a corpus of sutras or teachings for the masses. So it's a particular kind of Buddha, but we can still say a very elevated being. So afflicted with an illness, this solitary Buddha entered Varanasi for alms after a doctor had prescribed for him a diet of wholesome food. So he approached the home of a merchant. The merchant saw him and asked, "Noble one, do you need anything?" "Homemade, nutritious food," he said. Then the merchant instructed his daughter-in-law, "Give wholesome food to the noble one." In his daughter-in-law, there arose a meanness. So this is the first time we're hitting this term matsarya, right? She's been given instructions by the merchant, and the daughter-in-law. In her arises this meanness, matsarya. And she thinks, if I give him food today, he'll just come back again tomorrow. She retreated indoors, filled a bowl with shit, then covered it with food and proceeded to give it to the solitary Buddha. Now, so she just acted out in a really cruel and vindictive way, right? I mean, she could have decided not to give the solitary Buddha any food at all. She could have explained her rationale, which is like, you're just going to keep coming back if I give you wholesome food, and I don't want to deal with you. But instead, she acts out with spite. This is part of the pathology that the Buddhists are getting at here with meanness, is that meanness doesn't cultivate rationality. Meanness cultivates this kind of cruel, spiteful, vindictive acting out that's also kind of childish, using kind of urine and excrement as kind of weapons. They're a lot like small children acting out with the weapons that they have. So now the text tells us now the knowledge and insight of disciples and solitary Buddhas doesn't operate unless they focus their attention. Meaning solitary Buddhas like this are kind of wise to the ways of the world and they know what's happening, but they have to focus their attention. And in this case, if the solitary Buddha had focused attention, he would have known that he was being handed a bowl of excrement. So it says, so the solitary Buddha accepted the bowl, and only after accepting it did he realize how much it smelled. She must have filled it with excrement, he thought. Then that great being dumped out his bowl to one side and departed. So why is this important that he accepted the bowl? What it means is that she's actually completed an offering. We might say she completed an act. Now, within the karmic world, this is terrible. She's given a terrible gift, which is not a gift at all. She's done it with a terrible intention, meanness and spite, matsarya, and she's done it to a being of kind of great merit, meaning that kind of magnifies the terribleness of her deed. So then the Blessed One says, what do you think, Moggulliana? The merchant's daughter-in-law at that time and at that juncture is now this hungry ghost. Since she performed such a sinful act, as a result, ever since, she is always reborn as a hell-being animal or hungry ghost, and she always feeds on feces. Therefore, Mogdaliana, work hard to rid yourself of meanness. That way you won't develop the same faults as that hungry ghost. It is this Mogdaliana that you should learn to do. So this is interesting. He's telling actually one of his advanced disciples, rid yourself of meanness. So the idea here is that meanness can arise in anyone. Meanness might arise. The trick is to not latch onto it. It isn't simply that you'll eradicate meanness even coming up. It's that you don't want to kind of grab onto it, hold on it, and cling to it. You want to see it for what it is and let it go. And then this, the last lines of the story. This was said by the Blessed One, with their minds uplifted, the venerable Mogdaliana and various gods, anti-gods, heavenly birds, kinnaras, great snakes, and so on, rejoiced at the words of the Blessed One. So that's a little bit of what a hungry ghost is and a little bit about meanness. But we realize here from doing it, there's a lot more about meanness, right? This is just a hint of what meanness is. You get a sense that what do we know so much so far about meanness, the kind of the psychology of it? Well, the first part is that it starts with a kind of clinging, a kind of holding on to things. And we often, this is paired up in lots of texts with a group of synonyms that we find in kind of in lots of materials, where it's kind of connected with terms like close-fistedness, holding close, clinging to one's possessions, right? That there's a part of it is that this starts with something like hoarding, holding on to more that you need and not practicing charity, right? But somehow hoarding one's possessions isn't enough to explain why one would literally put shit in a monk's bowl, right? I mean, so clinging doesn't get us far enough, but it's a start. So one way to begin to make sense of this is to look at the great kind of Buddhist commentators. And what I want to do now is switch from the Sanskrit to Pali. So from the word Matsarya in Sanskrit to Pali Matsarya. So we can look at actually some of the writings of the great commentator Buddhaghosa. He's one of the most famous commentators in the Buddhist world. And Buddhaghosa, or his Buddhaghosa and his team, have written commentaries on almost all the Pali texts, and his writings are incredibly astute. So in one of his most famous compilations, the Visuddhimagga, Path of Purification, says this about meanness, Matsarya. It says, it is meanness, or Matsarya, miserliness, avariciousness, something. Its characteristic is concealing one's prosperity, whether already attained or yet to be attained. Its function is not enduring the condition of sharing that prosperity with others. Its manifestation is contraction, or its manifestation is close-fistedness. Its proximate cause is one's own prosperity. It should be seen as a condition of mental deformity. And that's actually very technical. And Buddhaghosa is writing in the lineage of Abhidhamma, a kind of, we could say, a higher psychology. But what he's saying is that it starts actually is with your prosperity, what you have, and the idea that you want to conceal it. You don't want anyone else to have it. And simply the idea of sharing this prosperity, sharing what you have, is kind of unendurable, unbearable. And that what its manifestation is a kind of contraction or close-fistedness. I mean, you can imagine you have your possessions and you're clinging to them, holding them close. Now, this is a start. And again, holding close isn't exactly as lashing out. So we're going to have to figure out, well, what's the connection here? Now, one way of making sense of this kind of meanness is to notice that one of the stories in this collection of 10 in the Avadana Shataka, which are all about hungry ghosts, 9 of the stories are about meanness, Matsarya, and one of them is actually about irsha, which is jealousy. And the text wants to make a connection between meanness and jealousy. So here's Buddhaghosa now commenting on what jealousy is. And for Buddhaghosa, Matsarya, meanness and jealousy are like kind of two sides of the same coin. They're very closely interlinked. So if you want to know something about meanness, you really need to know something about jealousy. And this is what he says about jealousy. He says, it is envying. It has the characteristic of being jealous of another's prosperity. Its function is to be dissatisfied with that prosperity. Its manifestation is aversion from that prosperity. Its proximate cause is another's prosperity. it should be regarded as a bond to existence. So they're saying is that there's this world of thinking about what others have and being jealous. And that jealousy means that somehow you look at what they have and then you're dissatisfied with what you have. And it develops a kind of aversion. And last, it says it's a kind of bond to existence. It's another thing that we could say that ties us down, that literally kind of binds us to our worst inclinations. So what's interesting about Buddhaghosa's take on meanness and jealousy for our purposes here is that if you think about this, he's envisioning a world where humans would see the world as a kind of brutal battleground for prosperity, whereby one's gain is another's loss and another's gain is one's own loss. So you can imagine you begin to be deluded with this idea of meanness. You're clinging to possessions, and then you kind of see what other people have, and there's a bit of jealousy and the idea that they might have what you have, or they might take what you have, or for some crazy reason, you might give to them what you have or be forced to do so. It becomes literally a kind of intolerable idea. So what's interesting, again, this, I find this material so fascinating for thinking about the human condition, but Buddhaghosa's vision of people who are taken over by this kind of meanness and jealousy is a kind of clinging and a contraction. You can imagine someone clinging and holding onto their possessions, making sure that no one got anything. But what we find in the Avadana Shataka and often in the narrative literature is something a little different. It isn't simply a drawing back or drawing in. It's really the opposite. It's a reaching out, an acting out, a lashing out. So the image that comes to mind for me is that of a cat on the hunt. First, she contracts her body in a crouch, retracting her limbs as if compressing a coiled spring, and then she pushes off and leaps on her prey, trying to deliver a lethal blow. Retraction leads to extension. What at first appears to be a kind of closing down or shutting down is only a precursor to violent action. So the Buddhists here are trying to kind of think about what could this pathology be? And notice that it leads from one thing to the next, something seemingly benign, clinging onto your possessions, right? We might think of it as benign as property claims. This is mine, it's not yours. But what they're saying is this idea of matsari, this idea of meanness can arise, and with it, meanness, jealousy, clinging, lashing out, and then this idea of, well, we'll get to that, but an idea of a kind of a transformative mindset that leads to self-righteousness. Now, the Buddhist world actually frequently talks about 5 kinds of macharya. This is 5 kinds of meanness. And again, looking at Buddhaghosa, he talks about these 5 as you can have meanness, or in this case, he's really thinking more about kind of miserliness, this kind of meanness, miserliness with regard to your home. You can hold on to your possession, right? And the idea that your home is part of you, and the idea that someone else would take it or in some ways invade it would take it as a kind of, could lead to this kind of meanness. We can have meanness with regard to families, meanness with regard to material gain, meanness with regard to reputation, and even meanness with regard to Buddhist doctrine, the Dhamma, the idea that I couldn't share it with someone else. It's mine. And again, that we could say this kinds of possessiveness. Now, we find throughout all this is one way to think about meanness is it leads to an idea that someone else getting something is almost unbearable. And again, what comes to mind for me is this idea of small children when they're required to share their toys. And clinging, the idea that I could possibly share with someone else, how could I ever do so? So another way to enter into this world of meanness is to look at what other teachers have said beyond Buddhaghosa, Buddhaghosa certainly being the most famous. But I actually find that some of the medieval commentators and others give us, and modern commentators, give us a way of making sense of Matsarya that actually kind of resonates a little bit more with my own experience of the world. So this is Mahasi Sayadaw. He's a renowned 20th century Burmese monk Many of his works have been translated. A famous teacher. This is what he says with what regard to Macharya meanness. He says, it is stinginess with regard to gain. This is the meanness with regard to the things that we earn, is to be jealous of another person's gain. It is also stinginess regarding gain, to be unwilling to share one's belongings with worthy people, such as respectable fellow monks and so on. It may not be stinginess, however, if one is too fond of something to give it away. It could also be attachment. Note that the characteristic of stinginess is to be unable to bear that others possess or use one's belongings, whereas the characteristic of greed is to be attached to one's belongings without being able to give them away. So here, once again, we have this notion of the unbearableness, that when this matsarya, when this meanness arises in us, we find being in the world and sharing with others unbearable. Our possessions have come to rule us. We think, or we might think, that we control our possessions, but in this case, our possessions, what we've gained, control us. And the idea that we would lose them, have to give them away, have to share with others, is simply unbearable. Now, another famous 20th century Burmese monk, Ashin Janakabhivamsa, also has an interesting take on meanness here that we might find helpful. And he says, they're talking about here not with matsarya, but macharya, the Pali term. And he says, stinginess is the nature of macharya. Nowadays, those who are not charitable and those who are reluctant to give anything to anybody are called people with macharya. But actually, macharya is not the lack of a will to give or be charitable. It is a wishing that others do not get anything. Not wanting to give is only the clinging to one's possessions. It is lobha, attachment. Macharya is the wish that others do not get anything by way of material gains or attributes, regardless of whether or not the materials or attributes belong to one. So this is interesting. Again, it isn't simply a clinging, it's the desire that others don't get something. And this is beginning to get at maybe the real importance of matsarya, meanness, for a modern world. It isn't just about me and being selfish. It's a kind of antisocial behavior. It's the idea that others must get nothing. And then taking pleasure when others actually do get nothing. And also taking pleasure to give someone something that they can't use and that they feel terrible about. So we begin to get this sense, the deviousness of this pathology. So it designates less a reluctance to give, as in being stingy or miserly, frugal, parsimonious. It's a fervent and unjust wish that others don't get anything, regardless of whether it's one's own property being given. And it's really nicely exemplified in another short story in the collection from that 100 stories that I talked about earlier, a story called Drinking Water, where we read of a monk who's tormented by thirst, who comes upon a well, and standing there's this young woman who's just filled a pot with water. And there he is, like dying of thirst. And he says to her, he says, "Sister, I'm tormented by thirst. Please offer me some water." And in that young woman, there arose a feeling of matsarya. Since she was clung to her possessions, she said to the monk, "Monk, if you were dying, I still wouldn't give you any water. My water pot wouldn't be full." So we get here again this kind of cruel meanness, which we might actually think of as almost a kind of madness, right? Why be so cruel? What does it do? And this is part of the Buddhist world. What they're thinking is that matsarya is a kind of madness, that what leads to first a kind of like stinginess, miserliness, parsimonious, cruelty, what it does is it actually leads to a kind of fault, as the text says, a kind of a dosha. And what that fault is a kind of self-righteous delusion. You are actually deluded by meanness, and that the cruelty isn't a just acting out, it's an unjust kind of delusion in the way the world works. Now, why does this matter so much? Well, one, it talks about within the Buddhist world that, oh, you can have some kind of terrible kind of repercussions in the world to come. But the texts are also explaining that it's terrible right now. Beings who are deluded like this and who are cruel to others actually kind of sow dissent, create a kind of cruel, antisocial world. Now, here's another twist I find in the kind of the Buddhist understanding of this. In the stories that we hear, the hungry ghosts are actually blessed or perhaps cursed with knowing the error of their ways. They know exactly what they did to be reborn where they are. Now, this is actually a kind of curse, because you could imagine beings being reborn in a terrible condition and thinking, this is just my bad luck. This is just fate. This is just the whims of the world. But no, hungry ghosts in these stories know exactly the deed that has led to their behavior. They, in fact, actually know the Dharma. They know that good deeds lead to good results, bad deed leads to bad results, and that the cultivation of meanness leads to actually the terrifying and terrible result of being reborn as a hungry ghost. Instead, what we find the text saying is that the real hungry ghosts at some level are humans like us who cultivate Matsarya. Now, the idea within the Buddhist world is that you can be reborn in one of the 5 or 6 realms of existence with various kinds of physical bodies. I can be reborn as a human and have a human body, and with kind of normal human thoughts. I could be reborn as an animal with an animal body and normal animal thoughts. But one of the abilities, especially as a human, is, we could say, to cultivate a variety of thoughts. So I could engage in meditative practices, so say the texts, and in some ways engaging in kind of advanced meditative states, I would be traveling, as it were, among the gods. Or my mind could be in the gutter, as we say now, and I could cultivate terrible mindsets. And literally, I'd have a human body, but almost cultivating the mindset of an animal or a hell being. And what the Buddhist texts are saying, in some ways, the real hungry ghosts here are those who are humans and who are cultivating Matsarya. Another way to think about it is, when these beings are overtaken by meanness, they have human bodies, but they have the mindset of hungry ghosts. They've temporarily visited the realm of hungry ghosts. They're like hungry ghosts in human form. And they're the ones who are really disgusting. That is the disgusting thing. And that is the thing, we might say, that we most want to avoid. Now, all this stuff, we could say, becomes really clear when we begin to think about kind of hungry ghosts in the visual world. Because one of the oddities which is apparent in the stories, but also when we look at images, is that hungry ghosts actually exist among us. Hungry ghosts are actually a lot like animals. It's said that they can exist in Yama's realm beneath the earth, but also they can exist in the human realm. So that animals, hungry ghosts, and humans share a reality. And just like animals might come out and see us and they might hide away, some are easy to see, some are difficult to see, and often they're afraid of us. Hungry ghosts are actually very similar. What we find in these stories is that they live on the fringes of society, and they function as a kind of outcast. They're kind of reborn and almost invisible to us, not because we need to cultivate some amazing sensibilities to see them, but simply because we've been trained not to see them. So the idea here is looking or thinking about hungry ghosts in images, we begin to see a different conception of hungry ghosts, and also to see how different cultures have thought about hungry ghosts. And more to the point, getting a sense of how hungry ghosts and humans are closer than they think, inhabiting the same realm. Now, let me just say a few words about hungry ghosts visually before I move actually and share some images with you and kind of talk about their importance. One thing that's interesting about looking at the images of hungry ghosts is to realize that these are not simply visual representations of the texts, right? It isn't simply that folks read the texts and then drew exactly what they saw. That what we find in this kind of world of images is that they're cultivating, they're trying to reach their community. So they're creating images that resonate with these groups of people that the images are destined for. And this will change according to geography from place to place and from time to time. And they're trying to kind of, we could say, conjure something that's meaningful for humans, offering a kind of teaching through image, and also doing something that we talked about, that idea of scared straight, that you see an image and it's so arresting so that you're kind of transformed. Now, the first thing that we know when we look at images of hungry ghosts is, again, to think about this hungry ghosts and the kind of a nature to suffer, right? I mean, as we saw in the stories from the Avadana Shataka, you don't want to be reborn with the body of a hungry ghost. It is a body for torment, designed for suffering. It's a kind of prison that one must suffer the consequences in for the karmic acts that one did as a human. And it's not a pretty place. So before I say more about hungry ghosts in images, what I want to do is give you a guided tour of some of my favorite hungry ghost images. And in some ways that will change our conversation. So this first image is one of the earliest images that we have of hungry ghosts. And it actually comes from a story of Shroni Kortakarna. This is actually a story that I translated in a first volume, Divine Stories, Part 1. And in it, we find a merchant who comes across a kind of an iron city filled with hungry ghosts. And here, if we notice on hungry ghosts, we can see that they're kind of skeletal, they're very thin, but again, no flames, right? No stomachs like mountains that we can tell, or tiny throats. So this is artists who are simply kind of imagining what these beings might look like. And we're going to find it will change from place to place. Another way to think about it is folks here have an anxiety about meanness, an anxiety about hungry ghosts, but there hasn't fully codified into one specific vision. And we're going to find that that vision changes from culture to culture. The idea of meanness doesn't change, but the idea of the specific torments of hungry ghosts and how their bodies might send messages, that changes. So this is an image, as I said, from kind of the Kizil Cave in China, maybe 5th century BC. And we can see these hungry ghosts kind of with arms flailing. Now, I love this little image. This is from a Bezeklik Cave in Turfan in China. And it's part of a giant image that's incredibly complicated with ghosts and other beings and deities. And this is just one little detail in the corner. And we have these hungry ghosts, and here, flames, right? We didn't have flames in the last image. Here we do have flames. But instead of a body immersed in flames, here it almost seems that they're breathing flames. And we'll find this in other cases, the idea that one of the curses of a hungry ghost isn't just that the food and drink that they pick up turns into urine and excrement, but in some ways that they're always breathing flames so that they can never consume anything. And I love the way this image, in its almost cartoonish way, looks incredibly modern. So this is a wonderful image. This is a Path of the Hungry Ghosts from 13th century. And in it, we see an image of 10 hungry ghosts. So here, there's a very different conception of hungry ghosts. Instead of hungry ghosts being singular, here we actually have, there are varieties of hungry ghosts in the same way that there are varieties of hell beings and there are varieties of divine beings, and that there are different torments that lead to different kind of statuses of hungry ghosts. And here we can say that there are 3 main divisions of hungry ghosts. The first, we see these top 3 beings, and these actually look quite a bit like the hungry ghosts that we saw in the texts, right? Tiny throats, giant stomachs. And in this case, we have 3 different varieties. The first hungry ghost we can see kind of like breathing flames. The second one with a kind of almost like simian-like features on the right. And the third actually kind of holding his mouth, that's a stink mouth hungry ghost. That one of his kind of tortures is that they have kind of terrible bad breath. The next 3 in this, we see a kind of needle nose, sort of needle point hungry ghost. They have fur that's like needles that's always poking them. And on the bottom right, one of my favorites, actually a kind of goiter hungry ghost, which you can imagine, again, would make it very difficult to eat, having a giant goiter. And another hungry ghost who emits a terrible smell from his fur, and hence he's holding his nose. And here, these kind of beautiful images here, these we might say would be more advanced hungry ghosts. These are kind of, we could say, almost royalty among hungry ghosts, imagining that there are different ways of being a hungry ghosts and different kind of registers of bad deeds that you could do. And here, these are hungry ghosts who actually have possessions as opposed to being dispossessed. And they almost look like royalty of sorts. They have jewelry. and they're decked, at least the one on the bottom, with a giant robe and a crown. And the 10th here seems to be no hungry ghost at all, really, but some kind of almost Brahmanic seer, a kind of almost a kind of saint. So again, what we see is that different representations of hungry ghosts emphasizing different phenomena. The first hungry ghosts that we saw, hungry ghosts that are kind of entrapped in a prison, in a kind of iron city. We might think of them as prisoners, not only in their hungry ghost bodies, but literally in a prison house that is this iron city where there is no food and water. In the second image, we saw these hungry ghosts kind of like breathing fire, getting some sense that they're aflame, burning. That's different than the first image. And now here we move again in China, and now we see a kind of pecking order of hungry ghosts. Imagine kind of different hungry ghosts with different torments. Now we move to one of the most famous kind of images of hungry ghosts, the Gakizoshi, from Japan in the 13th century. These are kind of housed in the national museums in Tokyo and Kyoto. And we get a very different vision of hungry ghosts, which in some ways seems modern, but will also bring us back to the early stories that we looked at. And here what we find with hungry ghosts is that they're inhabiting the world with us. Hungry ghosts aren't off in some magical realm. They're right here, and they're part of, we might say, city life. They're right here around us. And again, this idea that they feed on excrement. Here we see hungry ghosts surrounded by people kind of urinating and defecating, and that is their only food, right? They're surrounded kind of by us, this kind of cruel fate. But again, that makes us think like, wow, hungry ghosts are among us. And maybe that will help us think, we could say, a different way about the world. So let's continue on, and I'll get back to that point. We see here another image of hungry ghosts kind of in the urban scene. Again, tiny necks, bloated stomachs, hair that's kind of red in color, and again, kind of feeding on feces. Now, an oddity of all this, when we look at these images of hungry ghosts, is that the hungry ghosts look very much like folks who are suffering from kwashiorkor syndrome, which is basically no food, famine victims. What happens for people who have no access to food or drink? What we know is they develop something called kwashiorkor syndrome. Their stomachs will bloat with fluid, their necks will become thin, their limbs will become gangly, their hair will become red, their eyes will become bloodshot. So suddenly we have this image here where hungry ghosts are kind of blurring the distinction between beings from some other realm and maybe just people who are really, really hungry. So this interesting idea of that feeding hungry ghosts and taking care of hungry ghosts might not be taking care of beings in some other realm, but taking care of the starving and hungry in our midst. And this brings up to a whole social and political dimension that we didn't find in the previous images, but we do find in these early texts, that we have an obligation to serve these other hungry ghosts, we could say these other beings, the hungry ghosts in our midst, and that they're recognized as a being not worthy of our scorn, but worthy of our care, regardless of how they might look, whether they're hungry ghosts or whether they're the kind of poor and starving being in our midst. We might even think of them as the homeless, who are not very clean, but are worthy of our love. So we continue on here, visions of hungry ghosts just outside the city in a cesspool, again, with urine and excrement, kind of their home. Another kind of these amazing and arresting images, these of hungry ghosts in a kind of charnel yard in a cemetery, surrounded by dead bodies. And again, we can see these images, particularly that figure on the right, so much like beings who are famine victims, right? Suffering from kwashiorkor syndrome. We see bloated stomach, tiny neck, gangly limbs, thin ankles and wrists, seemingly long fingers, loss of hair, and then hair pigment kind of dying red. So again, that it would resonate with others, that these are beings who are kind of worthy of our care. They are simply beings who are starving, the hungry part of hungry ghosts. And this is a wonderful image of a hungry ghost before a monk. Now, this is one of my very favorite images. This is the Burning Mouth Ghost King. This is also the image that's featured on the cover of my book, Hungry Ghosts. And this is an image that tells a story. So what's the story? It's said that once Ananda was approached by the Burning Mouth Ghost King, and the Burning Mouth Ghost King said to him, "Hey, Ananda, in 3 days, you're going to die and be reborn among hungry ghosts unless you can manage to feed millions of hungry ghosts before those 3 days are up." When Ananda, the Buddha's right-hand man, and a great disciple in his own right, hears this, he's terrified because he can't think of any way to feed millions of hungry ghosts within 3 days. So he approaches the Buddha, and the Buddha says, I have a way for you to feed all those hungry ghosts. And that prompts the Buddha to teach Ananda a ritual for feeding hungry ghosts. And what we see here is an enactment of that ritual, we could say, in reasonably modern times, this being a kind of a medieval Chinese image. So here we have Ananda with his 5-pointed hat, marking him out as the officiant of ritual. He has his kind of ritual objects in his hand, a bell and a vajra, and before him is the kind of officiant's altar with his 2 people helping on both sides. We have candles on this altar, and we can see on the far right side of the altar is a text. Now, what's interesting is this is the text, presumably, that Ananda is reciting, and we can see those leaves on the end of the table, and there's a hungry ghost who's participating in the ritual, helping Ananda. We can see him right next to the table carrying one of those leaves, and further down, just below that to the right, we can also see we can see a hungry ghost with kind of the pages of the manuscript on his back. Now, the oddity here is they don't know what the original text looked like, so we can see that the text is blank. There's nothing written on it. And the pages, not looking like birch bark or anything, seem a little too thick for manuscript pages. Nevertheless, there's the book and the text that Ananda is reciting as a way of feeding the hungry ghosts. And part of this ritual involves creating these 3 stupa-like mounds full of food for hungry ghosts. On the far left is vegetables. In the middle are steamed buns, a kind of bread. And on the right are rice on this kind of raised bed of offerings. And through this recitation, we can see on the far right, we can see hungry ghosts streaming down from the background, getting the food and then streaming back up. So if we look at the hungry ghosts up close, we'll see that many of the hungry ghosts have come and have already availed themselves of the bread offerings, right? That seems to be their favorite of the offerings. So the idea here is that hungry ghosts can be fed, that we can actually care for those who are hungry, both literal hungry ghosts, but also the hungry in our midst. And that this developed into a Hungry Ghost Festival and Hungry Ghost rituals, which entail feeding the hungry and feeding the hungry in our midst. So we're finding here what we see particularly through images is a slippage between the world of hungry ghosts as a special class of beings and those who are simply hungry here, because both actually inspire the best of us, right? Not meanness, but charity. Not a kind of contraction, but a kind of extended love. So, and that this is the cure. If you're looking at what's the cure for meanness, it's charity, it's giving. Don't hold on to your possessions, share your possessions. And part of this is inspired through Ananda's ritual. Now, if we look up close, we can see that the hungry ghost who inspired this story, Burning Mouth Hungry Ghost, here has one of the bread dumplings. He has been a recipient of the gift. And you can see, if we think back on that image of the 10 hungry ghosts, of the different kind of classes of hungry ghosts, this is a hungry ghost who is not, we could say, is one of the better off hungry ghosts, right? He actually has, he's wearing jewelry, he has clothes, and he doesn't seem as tormented as others. He does have a smile nonetheless. And what's interesting about this is if we look up top, there's a connection between this hungry ghost and the Bodhisattva Guanyin. And we can see that Guanyin, that little line connecting Guanyin to the hungry ghost, the idea here is that Guanyin is kind of pulling the strings here, and that she in her kind of wisdom, has inspired this Burning Mouth Ghost King to ask Ananda, or we could say to threaten Ananda with the punishment of being reborn as a hungry ghost, so that he would ask the Buddha, and the Buddha would then share this ritual such that all these hungry ghosts could be fed. So now we move to an image of a Tibetan painted scroll, a tanka, representing the wheel of existence, the samsara chakra or bhava chakra. Now, this is some of the most famous images for kind of, we could say, contemporary Buddhism. We often see them particularly within the Tibetan context. Now I can say something kind of interesting, I think, why there are almost no pre-modern images of hungry ghosts within the Indian context. But as soon as we move to the Tibetan context, they're represented all the time. We have many Tibetan images of hungry ghosts. And it's that question of, what is it that the Tibetans found so compelling? So here's what I talked about before, where we find the 6 realms of hungry ghosts. On the top, it might be a little bit difficult for you to see. We'll have heaven on the top, and we can see the kind of gods enjoying themselves. We'll see hell beings down below, and we'll see right here the realm of hungry ghosts. And let's zoom in on that realm. So here's the realm of hungry ghosts here. And we see, again, this connection with hungry ghosts and fire, right? There's fire all around. These are hungry ghosts who are kind of breathing flames. They do, once again, have very tiny necks and kind of big stomachs. It's a very stylized representation of hungry ghosts. And within the realm of hungry ghosts, we'll find there are 2 beings who stand out. One on the left here, this is no doubt Yama. He has a staff made of skulls. And we can think of here, he has a kind of kingly feature within the realm of hungry ghosts. And this, we're not exactly sure. My guess is it's probably Hariti. We could say a famous kind of goddess within the Buddhist world, famed for kind of feeding many children. And here, she's probably cursed, because in this realm of hungry ghosts, where one cannot feed anyone, she has 2 children that she also can't feed. But what we see here is that there's a kind of way out. And above, we see certain beings who are in cloud halos. And we see especially the Buddha and his kind of bodyguard to the right, and up in the far right corner here, Tara. And we see below them that their beings here aren't breathing flames. In some ways, they've at least been kind of given some relief. And it's one way of various beings who can offer relief to others. So we're starting to see here is that there are very different conceptions visually of hungry ghosts in different places, and the different kind of relief that they can be offered in different ways that they might help us think about our relationships with one another, and also relationships to those who might offer us comfort, those who might offer us food, or simply make the flames a little less. Now, this is a fascinating image. This is from an illustrated manuscript from Thailand of the Pramalai Klon Suat. This is a text about the great Thai monk Pramalai. And this is the first page of a manuscript. It's going to tell you what's happening in the manuscript. And in it, Pramalai will go on great adventures. And what we're going to see here is that Pramalai will adventure off to the realm of hungry ghosts, which we see on the left, and the realm of hell on the right, which we're not going to discuss. So here he is in the realm of hungry ghosts. And we see here beings have a very different set of torments than we read before. In the text, we talked about beings who had really tiny necks and giant stomachs and were aflame. And then when we saw the hungry ghosts in maybe in the Chinese example, we saw different hierarchies of hungry ghosts. Now, here we have hungry ghosts that have a very special set of torments. On the far left, we see a being with something thrown over his shoulder. What the text says is that's actually his testicles, that one of the punishments for kind of being mean and cruel is to be burdened with gigantic testicles that you must wear over your shoulder. And in the text, it says that this is a special punishment for government officials who basically don't share the wealth and cling to it and misappropriate funds. We see other beings here in the middle who has no face, but her face is actually where her genitalia would be. We see the being next to her as, again, kind of faceless with flaming genitalia. Another being here with a face and a body like a water buffalo. We see them again very thin with kind of very notable spines. And again, here, this being on the far right with forehead ablaze. And within the text, we read about different, we could say, different faults and different terrible things that people did that resulted in these different results. So again, we could say a hierarchy of bad deeds. Then this is, I thought, would be interesting as a kind of a way of thinking about the way the idea of hungry ghosts has migrated. So this idea of customized torments that develop because of particular actions takes root within the Jain tradition, and it also takes root in kind of, we could say, modern day India, particularly in the beginning of the 20th century. These images, known as karni barni, you reap what you sow, are prevalent all throughout India. And in it, we find that if you do a terrible deed, you will face a terrible result. And in this case, you can see various beings and the bad things that happen to them. On the upper left, what are those who actually pierce a bull through the nostrils? And here we have a human with with nostrils pierced. What happens to those who kill fish, who are fishmongers? And here they are suffering a cerebral torment. Again, the being next to them in that top row, someone who else collides and cheats with ledgers, that's the torment. And again, someone who drinks alcohol illicitly, and that's the torment. So what we see here is this idea, not exactly of hungry ghosts, but customized karmic torments because of the activities that you've done, migrate out of the Buddhist world and enter into other domains, the Jain world, and here simply into modern day India. I have one more image to share with you, and this is a modern image. It's a wonderful image that was shared with me by Matthew Meyer, who's kind of a modern day artist, does fantastic work actually on kind of deities and folk deities in Japan. And this is an image that he did of hungry ghosts. And what I find peculiar is, although it's by far the most modern image in the collection, it's actually the image that we could say most closely replicates the text, the hungry ghosts that we were reading about. Here are hungry ghosts that are clearly in a city, but left alone, or we could say unnoticed, in front of a home where no one notices them. They have tiny necks and giant stomachs, gangly limbs, and where urine and excrement is their only food, and literally kind of forced to kind of survive on excrement in this horrible, pitiable condition, with this central female figure squatted down and moaning, and everyone else involved in some variety activity of eating excrement. Okay, now I want to pause, kind of leave the images here for a moment, and go back to actually thinking about what do we get from these images. Now, when we think about these images, they are meant to be arresting. The idea behind these images is that they're doing something different from texts, is that seeing something can be shocking. And we find this actually kind of, we could say, most prominently actually in the Buddha Charita. This is perhaps the most famous life story of the Buddha, written by Ashvaghosha, probably in the 1st or 2nd century. And we could say it's the first codified narrative, the first great poem of the Buddha's life. And in this is a story that's probably familiar to many of you, that the young Buddha at this time is a prince living in the palace, and it's been foretold that he'll either be a great renunciant or a great king. His father wants him to be a great king, so he protects him from anything that might lead him astray. And one of the things he fears will lead him astray is if the young prince sees anything unsightly. So as it happens, the Buddha hears stories of the city's groves and parks and how beautiful they are, and he wants to see them. And his father wants to arrange an excursion to keep his son happy and shielded, but he's afraid that if he sees unsightly things, it will send him off the path of becoming a king. So we have these two verses. I'm just going to read you from my translation from these two verses of the Buddha Charita. So to keep his son happy, the father does this. He gives these orders. He prevented ordinary people with afflictions from gathering on the royal highway, thinking the tender-minded young prince must not experience samvega. And I'll explain that term in just a second. Then with supreme gentleness, they sent away from all corners those with missing limbs or defective senses, the old, the sick, the poor, and the like, and made the royal highway supremely beautiful. So what happens is the Buddha, the young kind of Prince Gautama, wants to go off and see the parks. The father is anxious that the young Gautama will see something unsightly that will set him away from the path of being a king and toward the path of being a great renunciant. So he gets rid of any unsightly things, all the people with missing limbs, the old, the sick, the poor, precisely the kind of people that we see as hungry ghosts, because he doesn't want the young prince to experience samvega. Now, what's samvega? Samvega is a really important term in this kind of early Buddhist world. And the idea is it's being kind of shaken to the core. The idea is that you're shaken and shocked out of your complacency. And what the king is afraid is that the Buddha will be kind of shaken. We might think of, again, this idea of scared straight, but being shocked into something. And with that shock, will head into a different direction. This is precisely actually what people want the images of hungry ghosts to do. They want them to shake you and to shock you out of complacency so that you no longer live in a world full of meanness and thinking that meanness is normal, and that you no longer live in a world where you cling and hold your possessions and don't share them with anyone else and find it intolerable to give up your possessions, intolerable that someone will get something that somehow they haven't deserved. So the idea is that these images will throw you, but throw you in a different direction, just as the young Gautama was thrown, in fact, precisely in the story. So if we return for a moment to that story from the Buddha Charita, this is precisely what happens. The young Gautama does, in fact, see four sights. He sees an old person, he sees a sick person, he sees a dead person, and he sees a mendicant, and it rocks his world. It completely transforms him because he realizes the impermanence of things and the possibility of actually escaping the impermanence of things, and goes off and becomes monastic. So one interesting thing about these images is that the images are meant to be arresting. They're meant to kind of shake us. Now, that shaking might be kind of even more profound if we suddenly think that, these images of other beings might simply be being in our midst. Maybe it isn't hungry ghosts per se, but just those who are starving and suffering in our midst. Would that be enough to transform us? Would that be enough to shake us awake? Now, what we find in the stories is that the folks who actually can see hungry ghosts and do act on those, what's interesting is they're not the smartest, they're not the most privileged, they're not even necessarily monks and nuns. What the texts kind of hint at again and again is that we are socialized not to see these beings. And this is part of, right, that, and there's a wonderful kind of story of Jambala, this young boy who has received no education at all, who's a social outcast, who lives on his own, and he simply can see hungry ghosts. There's a kind of, we could say, an innocence and a knowledge that comes with the innocence. And what the texts are kind of hinting at here, not so subtly, is that part of the problem that we have with meanness, and we could say of not acknowledging those who are poor and suffering and in need of charity in our midst, is that we're socialized and educated not to see them. So part of the shock that we need is the shock out of our education, the shock out of our socialization. There's a wonderful verse that we read elsewhere where the Buddha explains, I'm reading my translation here. He says, one ignorant because of his innocence is actually wise in this case. but one ignorant and thinking himself wise is rightly recognized as a fool. But this ignorance because of one's innocence. So there's a way of maybe the images themselves can help us cultivate a particular kind of innocence, right? That you could look at these images and then be transformed. So let me leave you with one last thing. This is a way of what might we do with all these stories and why might these stories matter? So first we started and looked at this idea of meanness as it occurs in Buddhist materials. And the idea here is that the Buddhists present a particular kind of pathology. The idea is that it starts with a kind of clinging to one's possessions. You're holding them close. And then that leads to a kind of unwillingness to give and to see others, we could say, and their prosperity and their possessions as a threat to you, so that one sees the world as a kind of battleground. So anyone else's gain is my loss, and I certainly don't want to give anything to anyone else. And pretty much anyone out there who's asking for anything is a kind of freeloader, or worse, someone who could possibly take things away from me. Now, this kind of diluted pathology, the text says, moves us far away from the realm of righteousness or dharma into a kind of self-righteous delusion where we see the world through some kind of very distorted glasses in such a way that we cling to things and act out cruelly and become a kind of a vehicle for an antisocial world, a vehicle where folks don't share, folks don't make common cause, folks don't come together. So it isn't simply that I'm clinging to something, I'm kind of destroying a social order. And we can see that the Buddhists recognize this as a particular danger and plotted for them a particular outcome, a rebirth in the realm of hungry ghosts as a unique punishment to call out the dangerousness of this particular kind of pathology, which is matsarya and meanness. But more than that, they want to explain that, the hungry ghosts, yes, there's that rebirth as a hungry ghost body, but the thing that's actually disgusting and the thing that we should focus on is a hungry ghost mindset. And we'll probably run into humans with hungry ghost mindsets on a pretty regular basis. They'll think that what's theirs is theirs and can never be shared, that the world is filled with a kind of freeloaders, and that one is justified in acting against them with a kind of spitefulness and kind of cruelty, not to try to change their behavior, not to try to convince them of the error of their ways, but to punish them in vindictiveness. And what the Buddhists say is that this is so dangerous, not just for those individuals and the rebirth that they might have, but also because it breaks down a kind of social fabric. Now, the cure to this is a kind of charity. It's a kind of giving. And as we saw, right, everyone might have this meanness that arises in them. The trick is not to latch onto it. So what can we do to not latch onto it? Well, one thing we can do is make offerings, is to give things, to make it a habit, not to cling things, to make it a habit to share, to make it a habit to help other beings. But also we can kind of investigate our own blindness to the world of suffering around us, the blindness to those who might be starving in our midst, the homeless person on the street that we somehow don't see, the poor part of our communities that we somehow really don't recognize, all the suffering in the world that we turn a blind eye to, and to really kind of to recognize that suffering, in part to shock us out of our complacency and maybe to send us on a different path. So one antidote to meanness is charity. And another antidote to meanness is to get ourselves shocked, to get ourselves kind of thrown and sent off in a different direction so that maybe we can experience something akin to the Buddhist notion of samvega, the shakenness that will send us in a different direction. So when we take this together, what first seems like, oh, there's stories about a fanciful world of hungry ghosts, and oh, there's this particular notion of meanness. What does that have to do with me? And my hope is that when folks read this material or maybe watch this talk or even kind of read my book or even just simply go in the world, and directly acknowledge the hungry and suffering beings in our midst, maybe they can change, and with them, they can actually change the society around them. I mean, that's the hope, isn't it? That somehow these stories can make the world a better place.